Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. It came out on April the 1st in the New York Times. It was an op-ed entitled, "All the Worst People Seem to Want to Be High Agency." But it wasn't a joke. It was quite serious. It's a very interesting op-ed about how the word agency has become deeply problematic. It was written by my guest today, Sophie Haigney, who's a writer based in Brooklyn, grew up in San Francisco, and she's joining us today. I was particularly taken with the piece. Sophie, you've spent a lot of time in San Francisco. Of course, the A word, agency, is on everyone's lips today. Everyone wants to be agentic of one way or the other. So how did you begin to realize that all the worst people seem to want to be high agency? Who exactly are these worst people?
Well, I will say what writers always say. I didn't write the headline.
Blame those terrible people at the New York Times, right?
Yeah, it wouldn't have been what I would have chosen. But there's something, maybe if we think of the worst people as the people, maybe if we think about the people who I think of as corrupting the term agency, it would be like it's the sort of tech overlords who want to dismantle the Department of Education, who see education in general as a kind of anti-agency programming where you learn to stand in line instead of how to cut it. So that would probably be the worst people that are referred to in the headline. But I think I first started hearing it, maybe a year ago, and it was kind of something that bubbled up even in casual conversations with people I knew. People would just say, do you think of yourself as like a high agency person? Are you like in the driver's seat of your own life? That was kind of how I was introduced to the term. And then I started seeing it more and more, especially in kind of the intersection of like self-help writing and entrepreneurship, podcasts, LinkedIn posts, places like that.
Yeah, I even found a website that promised high agency in 30 minutes. It sounds like Tim Ferriss's book about the 4-day work week or the 4-hour work week or whatever it is. So, of course, the usual suspects are the people you're talking about. Sam Altman, who was the victim, if that's the right word, the 2 assassination attempts at the weekend. You quote in your piece that Sam, when asked what skills to develop in the age of AI, the first one that Sam listed was become high agency. Also, you mentioned in the piece Mark Zuckerberg and his notion of moving fast and breaking things. Is this just another way of arguing, Sophie, that the tech bros are ruining the world?
I think there's some, it comes out of the same ethos as like move fast and break things, disrupt stuff. It strikes me as a little distinct, maybe because it's specifically something that people seem to be arguing is like an AI-proof trait. It's like a uniquely human capacity, supposedly, that we have for making decisions, thinking outside of the box, taking big swings and risks. To me, it seems like there's kind of a new formulation of some old ideas. Obviously, agency is something that has been around for a long time and discussed in philosophy and debates about free will. But the way it's being used today, I think, to me, it has a lot of connotations about risk taking. If you're high agency, you're the kind of person who is not taking no for an answer. If someone tells you your credit is too bad to start a business, you find a way to do it anyway. Like that's kind of the mentality of the high agency person in the Silicon Valley term.
Maybe there's another A word that we can associate with agency, which is American.
Yes.
The whole idea of agency, of the American dream, of self-realization. All this stuff is very much bound up in traditional notions of Americanness, isn't it, Sophie?
Yeah, I think it very much is. And I was thinking when I was writing this piece about Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, Self Reliance, which is kind of a classic American text, self sufficiency on the frontier, all of that feels very old to me. And it is kind of in some ways a version of that individualism and resourcefulness that we associate with Americans. I do think there's something slightly new about this particular packaging of it. And the way that I was drawing the distinction in the piece, I think, when I was growing up, I'm 30, so I'm not that old, but when I was growing up, people, especially on the right, would say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, climb the ladder. The idea was like you had to get a job, save up some money, maybe you buy a house, you kind of incrementally build up success and kind of make a life for yourself. And when I was working on this piece, I happened to be in San Francisco, and I talked to someone who said, the lowest agency thing you can do is have a 401k. That's like a very low agency thing to do with your money. You should be taking that money and putting it somewhere where it's going to make a lot more money a lot more quickly. So I think it's this kind of new individualism that has a little bit more of a gambling element to it, a little bit more of like not just regular old work your way up, more put it all on red and see what happens, because the rewards for that are so much more significant potentially.
But isn't all that true, that having agency is, for better or worse, essential in the 2020s in America? And if you don't have it, for better or worse, you're screwed.
I think there are some, first of all, I just say I think agency is an essentially neutral trait. Like it's really about what you do with it more than about having it or not having it. So it's a really good thing to, be in control of your own life, to have the ability to act of your own free will. I worry about a society, though, that puts so much emphasis on risk. I don't actually think it's a great idea for many people to start a business with terrible credit. I think there are some really positive things about working within a specific framework of like, okay, how can I have more agency in my job? Let's say my boss doesn't totally control me. Can I find a way to, take a little bit more initiative? That seems like a straightforward good to me. It seems not so positive to me that we're emphasizing the gambling and risk taking as like the value of our time. Because for risk is just really different for different people is one part of it. And second of all, I don't think it's an inherently bad thing to slowly and incrementally build up a life. Like I don't think having a 401k should be frowned upon necessarily for most people, including myself. I'm not going to invest my money. I know about myself, or I believe about myself, and maybe this is low agency. It's probably better for me to just put my money in the S&P 500 and see what happens than to try to do some crazy day trading maneuver.
You mentioned Emerson, his associate friend, the guy who was always talked about in the same breath as Emerson, is Thoreau. Thoreau famously, of course, went to Walden Pond and claimed to be independent, claimed to have agency, but he also famously got his mom to do his washing for him, his laundry. Is there a gendered quality here? I mean, you've mentioned in your piece Sam Altman, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, of course, comes to mind. You're obviously female. I'm not suggesting that women don't have agency or have different notions of what agency is. But should one approach this debate about high agency and the promise of agency in gendered terms too?
I think there's probably, certainly when I've seen agency talked about, for instance, in that essay, High Agency in 30 Minutes that you referenced, I was sort of like waiting for when they were going to name a woman with high agency. And I can't remember if he ever did, but there were not many women mentioned there. And partly that's like the risk of, I guess, using historical examples. You end up with history being mostly written about and by men for a bunch of reasons. But I think there's some gendered elements to it. Like, I think one one thing, when I was talking about risk, if you have, and this isn't inherently gendered, but if you have a family that you're thinking about, if you have ties to a certain community that you like care a lot about, whether that's a city where you live, or maybe your parents living somewhere, um, you're much less likely to think, gosh, should I like move to the desert and start a storage business in the American West by myself, which does seem like that's a traditionally masculine thing to do. I think we can probably agree on that. And so I think there might be some masculine qualities to the way that this ethos is being promoted. And I think some feminine qualities to the more cautious or community oriented or family oriented way of thinking about ties and weighing risk.
Your piece, All the Worst People Seem to Want to Be High Agency, cites some very popular podcasts, male podcasts of muscular men with beards talking to one another about agency. I was watching a couple of them while I was preparing. We've done many shows, Sophie, as you can imagine, on this supposed crisis of the male. Scott Galloway has a best-selling book. Richard Reeves came on the show. Jonathan Haidt. Seems to be a whole class of male writers on this crisis. Do you think that the issue of agency is one way we can get to the problem with young men these days, and perhaps in contrast to young women, although young women aren't always happy, but that these young men grow up, particularly on the internet, in a culture where high agency is promoted as being the thing in itself, in a highly seductive way. But of course, the world makes it very hard for most people to be high agency individuals. So that explains the anger, the resentment, the misanthropy, the hatred of females, the violence sometimes online.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there. I mean, I think one thing that interests me, I do think there is, I mean, we live at a time when like even just sports gambling is at an all-time high, and that's that's not all men, but it's a very, very male dominated space. And so I think that's like one area where I think you can really see the masculinity and then risk oriented agency kind of come together with some really negative consequences. I think one thing that I found interesting in the response to the piece, and this is related to what you were saying, I think people who disagreed with me most tend to see like passivity as the biggest issue in society, maybe passivity for men, like the people growing up as these passive consumers of social media, TV stuff, not making the most of their life, getting kind of stuck, and that being like the real crisis of our time, and maybe a specifically masculine crisis of our time. Whereas there's people who agreed with me more, I think, are much more concerned about the pace and scale of disruption, technological disruption, and think that the worst thing is really that we're moving too fast and breaking too much. And both of those things are obviously bad. And I see the latter as much more of a threat. But I think what you were getting at, like, there's this weird interplay between those two things. Like, we are at a time when a lot of people are really like feel really, really stuck, but also feel really like they need to, they're like two steps away from, I don't know, winning the lottery or something. There's like this really odd stuckness and then desire for big rewards, or belief that like it's all possible if somehow they could like win in this system that feels rigged against them somehow. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think the word you introduced, the word stuckness. We've done lots of shows on that. There've been a number of books written about why America is stuck one way or the other and why nothing can get done. I think you're also right to bring in gambling, because life itself has become a kind of lottery, which goes against the notion of a high agency, of course, because if it's a lottery, it doesn't matter what you do. You just buy your lottery ticket, you make your bet on the future, and it doesn't really reflect yourself. It doesn't really reflect any kind of self-management. So it speaks to the paradox of our condition, that we want high agency, but we live in a world where it's increasingly hard.
Yeah, and I mean, gambling is such a weird thing, especially, I mean, I think that the form of maybe like online sports betting in particular, and thinking about men who get addicted to it, you feel like you can win at the system. You feel like you have all this inside knowledge, and maybe you can a little bit, and maybe if you're really, really good at it, you can. But ultimately, there are ways in which it is rigged against you, or the average person just isn't able to reach the level of uh, knowledge or like your professional ability to gamble. And I think it's this weird, it's this like trap of people having the sense that they are so close to using their very specific knowledge to kind of crack out of this stuckness, and yet the system itself is making them more stuck.
Yeah, it is in a way the new drug. You wrote an interesting piece in the New York Times Magazine about TikTokers trying to, quote unquote, maybe this was another headline writer in the Times, trying to detox their timelines. The memes were too strong. So all this stuff about agency is bound up in an age where we're all, of course, addicted to one thing or another. But it's not. I know you wrote something interesting about the Grateful Dead. Your parents were deadheads, and you grew up in that culture, at least in San Francisco, in a nostalgic sense. But in the
Hmm.
60s, the Grateful Dead and the drug culture was one kind of addiction, I guess. Today, that addiction has taken a new form, in digital form, with TikTok, with online gambling, and of course, ultimately, the biggest addiction on the horizon is AI.
Yeah, and I think one thing I find troubling about, the people who are kind of promoting high agency the most seem to be the people who are building these tools that are most inclined to rob people of their agency. That's how I view it. I realize that that's a particularly negative view of technology and these tools, but I think, if uh Sam Altman, to use him as an example, is saying become high agency, like that's the tool of the future. I don't see AI as, for the average person, a particularly agency enabling tool. I think it is more likely to be like social media and ultimately lead people astray down rabbit holes into addictive behavior. I can see that for some people, AI is like the most agency inducing thing, because suddenly you don't even need to know how to code and you can start a company. I just don't, my view of how these tools will be used is more pessimistic, I think, shaped by, the time through which I've grown up.
Yeah, and of course, with smart machines, as many pessimistic analysts and observers and writers on AI suggest, we are this is our last invention. We're writing our own obituary as a species. So this issue of agency and smart machines is particularly acute these days. On the one hand, you have the Sam Altmans of the world, the Elon Musk, well, particularly Sam Altman, who argues that AI will empower us, will enable our agency. On the other hand, the pessimists, I don't know if you saw the AI doc, it's a new film which
No, I haven't
pits
seen
the pessimists against the utopians,
it.
which will free us. So AI, it seems to have reached a kind of climax, and I wonder whether, and I think you kind of hinted in this in your op-ed, we live in an age where the old ideological divisions, left, right, liberal, conservative, communist, capitalist, none of them seem to make much sense anymore. I wonder whether the A word, agency, will become the axis around which new political organizations and ideologies will develop.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting because I do think it's this weird, it's a word that I think right now is somewhat being claimed by people with right-leaning ideas, say people who want to abolish the Department of Education because they are not being innovative enough, etc. Um, and I do think it's also true that like people on the left or liberals or leftists for a long time have really emphasized, say, like, structural inequality, structural racism, the way that if you were born in a certain way, that would come to define you, perhaps almost to a fault, overemphasize that. Though I do also, believe basically in structural inequality. But I think like some of it is breaking down weirdly because if you think about the older brand of pull yourself up by your bootstraps conservatism, that looks very low agency from some vantage points. Or if you look at people farther to the left with radical ideas about how we might reform prescription drug pricing, like that's also very high agency. That's extremely outside of the box, risky. And so I wonder, yeah, I do kind of wonder how this will end up and if it just means that people with more extreme ideas or more outside the box ideas will be the ones who are kind of claiming the agency side of things, and then people who are more maybe in the center or are clinging more to old political orders will end up looking kind of low agency.
And maybe those who are critical of agency might be accused of a degree of nostalgia. I know you're writing a book called Future Relics, an essay collection about obsession and nostalgia. In your New York Times piece, I'm quoting, you say, high agency is individualistic, which means systems are suspect. Um, Britain's National Health Service, railways, and the American Department of Education. Most people love all three, especially the NHS. So, is there a danger that your party, so to speak, your skepticism towards high agency is a form of nostalgia for the 20th century, for longing for things that for better or worse, can no longer exist, whether it's railways, certainly American railways, that's another example of stuckness in America, Britain's NHS, or the American Department of Education, which of course Elon Musk seems to have got great satisfaction out of demolishing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are likely nostalgic or idealistic elements to being attached to systems. I think it's possible to say, for instance, I'm attached to railways without inherently uh without inherently being wrong, because I think you could argue, we simply need to build better railways, but of course that's not working. It's not happening. California's the best example of a place where that's not happening. And so I think I am there is some danger to the nostalgic element of element of things. Um, I do think though that one thing that we can be nostalgic for and could try to reclaim would be some notion of like values and morals attached to agency. That doesn't seem to me like we're too far gone. Like couldn't we be high agency and organized to build a better railway? Wouldn't it be high agency to fix the education department rather than abolishing it? It's hard to exactly see the path forward, and I'm not obviously myself a politician, but um, I'm not sure it's entirely a lost cause to try to reattach some set of values to the idea of agency rather than to see agency only as a means to disruption or to destruction of existing systems without creating anything to replace them.
Yeah, I wonder whether America has just become I mean, speaking of railways, a low agency sort of place. The Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson book, I don't know if you saw it, Abundance,
Yeah.
which is a bestseller, compares the California failure to build, I don't know what it is, a few hundred yards of high-speed train tracks in comparison to the Chinese model, which have successfully developed thousands of miles of high-speed trains. Of course, China is not a democracy. So how does this play out in political terms, in terms of democracy. Is this the promise or the problem with democracy, this whole issue of high agency? Can democracies work where you have a few high agency characters, the Zuckerbergs, the Musks, the Altmans, and everyone else is, to quote you, is stuckness?
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. I do think there's a way in which high agency is a little anti-democratic, or even if I think about people who, a high agency president on the left, FDR is an example of someone who I think he would did the kinds of things I was talking about nostalgically. But he threatened to pack the court. He kind of rammed things through using wartime powers. He overran term limits. I do think sometimes to get things done, whether it's in this like corporate sense or in this or in a government sense in a high agency way, does look pretty anti-democratic. And I don't know exactly what to make of that for what that means for our moment right now. But I think one of my issues with, I think, actually agency being promoted to the degree that it is that when I look at some of the most high agency individuals in history, it's probably like, Hitler. And I find it very odd that agency is being promoted for its own sake rather than being connected to any kind of value system, any kind of morality, because without those things, agency looks pretty scary at high levels when it's exercised. I mean, dictators I think, are quite high agency.
Yeah, and we certainly, speaking of the worst people, those dictators are clearly, no one's going to argue in favor of them. So if all the worst people seem to want to be high agency, who are the models for the best people for you? I know you didn't write this headline, but what should we want to emulate? I mean, you're in Brooklyn. You have a mayor of New York City who many people are citing as a good person, as a model for the future. What for
Yeah.
you? Who are the maybe not the best people, but the better
No,
people
I
that
was
we could
thinking about
use
that.
as
I mean,
models in the context of this whole problem with agency?
I was thinking about that actually, like Zoran Mamdani as a sort of foil to Trump, to extremely high agency politicians, both I think in what they're trying to accomplish, but also even in the way that they've approached politics. Neither of them. I mean, Trump had no government experience, Zoran very little, running for office without experience, and then um, attempting to come in and make big changes, but and also really just like conducting politics in different ways. So I mean, I am myself, a fan of Mamdani's, and it's pretty early in his mayoralty. I don't think it's easy to say exactly yet what, I can't quite like evaluate it yet, but I think his candidacy, and then also just the way that he's approaching politics, strikes me as very high agency from the left. I think there are other models of people, though, like types of people, um, who might be high agency and are not really being considered in the context of this tech civilization. I mean, we were talking about deadheads. I was thinking about, a friend of mine who moved to the desert in New Mexico and kind of lives this out of the box life, where he's just kind of on a farm in someone's backyard in a yurt, living communally, very happy, kind of does ecstatic dance, ceramics. But he's someone who, just like me, went to university, would have potentially just very easily done some sort of corporate job. And, he thought, like, this doesn't make me happy. So I'm going to do this other thing. And I think there's something in that form of agency, just personal agency, and that's kind of more like the Thoreau model of it. And of course, we can't all do that, but doing things that are not what everyone expects you to do, knowing that you're not controlled by a bad boss, by expectations that you go to law school, by etc. Like that all strikes me as a really positive form of agency, and that is a little less divisive, maybe.
I know you grew up in San Francisco and you've I read one of your pieces, which you articulated a degree of nostalgia. You wrote a good piece back in 2019 about San Francisco. Please stand up. I'm in San Francisco. I know you just grew up there, but you spent a lot of time here. Seems as if that's what makes San Francisco, living in it, visiting it, such a surreal place, because you have these the coexistence of these two extreme forms of either high agency or absence of agency. On the one hand, it's full of millionaires and billionaires and high tech and AI, Anthropic and OpenAI now based here. Sam Altman has a huge estate up on Pacific Heights. And on the other hand, of course, it's also a place of tent cities, of massive homelessness, of people without agency. Do you think there's some truth to that? That's what makes San Francisco so troubling and also so weird.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly like that really weird, I guess, oscillation between like inequality, the extremes of inequality, and then also the kind of failure of government services in some ways. And then you have these individuals who are obsessed with circumventing taxes. There's a lot of really weird stuff going on with the politics of San Francisco, and I think these kinds of agency. And San Francisco has always been weird as a site of counterculture and these different forces coming together, like libertarians, hippies, people whose politics might seem to also be at odds with each other, but kind of makes sense in this weird way, in this blend of like, I mean, at least how San Francisco used to be, kind of misfits and outsiders who were like interested in living slightly different ways or slightly on the margins of society. Yeah, so I think there is something very troubling and also very compelling about, I guess, just considering San Francisco and considering what it represents to so many people. I mean, it's also just such a symbol. Like when I'm there, I often just feel like I'm in a normal, beautiful city, and it doesn't. And you see the billboards that say, "Are you agentic?" And then you see the tent cities, and you see that, but it's also just a normal place. But it symbolizes so much in the American imagination, I think, about these extremes of agency, of inequality, of different modes of living in slightly unconventional ways.
Finally, as I said, you've got this collection of essays coming out you're working on now called Future Relics. Do you think when it comes to agency, we should be historicizing it? In other words, in 50 or 100 years' time, will people look back at the 2020s and think, well, that was that period where everyone was obsessed with the idea of agency, and now we know better?
I think that seems right to me, that this set of ideas will have emerged. I think specifically in the face of AI and what we don't know. I mean, I really think a lot of this is coming from some place of fear, or for some people it's excitement, but from some sense of we don't know what's coming next. And so what do we have to offer that's uniquely human? And this is one answer to it, this idea that we have this very specific capacity for taking risk and making decisions, and that we should cling to that and cultivate that as we like move into this very unknown period. I think we will be able to kind of look at that and say, that was a really strange moment and a set of values that emerged in the face of a new technological regime.
Yeah, it's really the irony. The only way to fight high agency and high agency people is with an agency of our own. But fascinating conversation, Sophie. We'll look forward. When's the book going to get done? We'll have you back on the show.
It'll be done in the summer. It'll be out next year, so we can talk about.
Well, I hope maybe you'll come back on before then. But best of luck with the book, and thank you for a really interesting and important conversation about the A word.
Yeah, thank you. This was fun.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.